The Great Flu and the Unseen Hand, America's Forgotten Plague of 1918. The premise, The Silence Before the Storm. The year is 1918. America is consumed by the Great War. Patriotism is paramount, dissent is suppressed, and propaganda dominates the media. Suddenly, a new enemy, invisible and terrifying, emerges from the very heart of the conflict. It is not the Kaiser's army, but a uniquely virulent strain of influenza, the Spanish flu, a tragic misnomer. This is the story of how this plague, more lethal than the war itself, swept across a nation united by conflict but utterly unprepared for a biological siege. It is a tale of medical heroism, government failure, social breakdown, and the birth of modern American public health, all under the cloak of wartime censorship and jingoistic fervor. Core factual and surprising elements for a 20,000-plus word narrative. This extensive narrative would be structured around three main acts, with deep dives into specific historical figures, documents, and locations. Act 1. The Seed of Contagion, Spring 1918. The Kansas Origin Myth and Camp Funston. The story starts not in Spain, but possibly in Haskell County, Kansas, or the massive military mobilization at Camp Funston, Fort Riley. The shocking detail is how the dense, unsanitary conditions of wartime military camps acted as a perfect incubator, transforming a mild flu into a killer. Wartime censorship. The astonishing fact is that the U.S. government, obsessed with maintaining morale for the war effort, actively suppressed news of the severity of the flu. This censorship led to the American public remaining dangerously uninformed. Only neutral Spain, free from wartime media restrictions, reported honestly, leading to the misleading name Spanish flu. The Unseen Transport. Detail the transatlantic voyage of American troops, the doughboys. The packed ships become floating death traps, carrying the virus across the Atlantic to Europe, and then its mutated, deadlier form back to American ports, Boston, Philadelphia. Act 2. The Apex of the Wave, Autumn 1918. Philadelphia's Fatal Parade, the most damning and factual turning point. Despite warnings from health officials, the city of Philadelphia insisted on holding a massive Liberty Loan Parade to boost war funding. Detail the parade's path, the immediate spike in cases 72 hours later, and the horrifying collapse of the city's infrastructure. Coffins piled up, bodies left uncollected, and mass graves dug by prisoners. The peculiar victim profile. Unlike typical flu, it preys on the very young and the old. The 1918 strain disproportionately targeted healthy young adults, ages 20 to 40. Explore the scientific and social reasons for this astonishing anomaly. This fact made the plague even more terrifying. The heroes of the unsung. Deep dive into specific, factually based heroes. Dr. Victor Vaughn, Dean of the University of Michigan Medical School and Army official, whose stunned observations documented the plague's unprecedented deadliness. The nurses of the American Red Cross, thousands of women who risked and often lost their lives, often in makeshift hospitals, fighting a disease they didn't understand. The Anti-Mask League, a surprisingly real and fascinating parallel to modern events. In San Francisco, a powerful group resisted mandatory masking laws, arguing they infringed on American civil liberties. Act 3. Legacy and the Unseen Hand, 1919 and beyond. The economic and social shockwave. Explore how the sudden loss of millions of able-bodied workers destabilized industries, contributing to labor unrest and the Red Summer of 1919, a period of intense race riots as social order frayed. The flu's role in exacerbating post-war tensions is a little-known startling fact. The birth of modern American public health. The realization that infectious disease required centralized, government-mandated action. Focus on the transformation of the U.S. Public Health Service and the move toward mandatory vaccination for other diseases and robust germ theory acceptance. The personal toll on American icons. Factual accounts of the flu's effect on major figures. President Woodrow Wilson. The documented evidence suggesting he contracted a severe case of the flu in 1919 while negotiating the Treaty of Versailles, possibly impairing his judgment and contributing to the failure of the U.S. to join the League of Nations, a monumental, world-changing consequence of the virus. The enduring mystery. Conclude with the factual, ongoing scientific effort to unearth and sequence the 1918 virus, including the incredible story of researchers retrieving lung tissue from bodies buried in the Alaskan permafrost. Why this story is perfect for a 20,000-plus word USA-focused narrative. Surprising. Most Americans vaguely know about the Spanish flu, but are unaware of its profound link to World War I, the role of U.S. Army camps, and the government's outright cover-up. Factual and detail-rich. The subject has been exhaustively researched in recent decades, offering detailed accounts of city-by-city responses, St. Louis versus Philadelphia, military records, medical journals, and personal diaries. The depth of material supports a massive word count. Engaging and timeless. The themes of censorship, mandatory masking, social panic, economic collapse, and the conflict between individual liberty and public safety resonate powerfully with a modern USA audience. Character-driven. The story is told through the eyes of nurses, soldiers, doctors, politicians, and everyday citizens, offering a rich tapestry of American life and struggle. The Unseen Hand. Prologue to the American Plague. Chapter 1. The Wind from Haskell County. The year 1918 smelled of grit, gun smoke, and blind, unwavering patriotism. America was a nation at war, consumed by the fight over there. Every factory churned out materiel, every citizen bought Liberty bonds, and every headline sang of victory. To question the war, or to allow any weakness to show, was treason to the cause. This obsession, this unprecedented total social mobilization, did more than just win the war. It built the perfect vehicle for a silent, deadlier enemy. The initial seed, the almost ignorable first tremor, didn't happen in the trenches of France or the teeming docks of New York. It happened on the windswept plains of Haskell County, Kansas. The doctor's alarm. Dr. Loring Minor, a plain-spoken country doctor in Haskell, was the first man to sound the alarm in the United States, though his warning was lost in the roar of war. Minor was used to rural illnesses, mumps, measles, the usual seasonal coughs. But in January and February of 1918, he started seeing something radically different. His patients, strong young farmhands and their families, were collapsing, not just with chills and fever, but with a terrifying speed. Their skin around their mouths and ears would turn a peculiar, alarming shade of heliotrope blue, a sign their lungs were failing to extract oxygen. This was no common cold. Minor had seen pneumonia, but never with this swift, hemorrhagic violence. On February 4, 1918, Minor wrote his chilling account for a federal public health report, describing an epidemic of influenza of the severest type. He noted the total prostration, the swift progression to severe pneumonia, and the high fatality rate. His report was one of the first, if not the first, official warnings of the coming storm. The startling historical fact is that this outbreak, which had the biological signature of the lethal virus, was occurring in a remote, agrarian pocket of America. How did it spread from an isolated Kansas farm? The answer lay with the war machine. The incubation chamber, Camp Funston. Haskell County, remote as it was a major supplier of recruits to the sprawling military training facility, Camp Funston, now Fort Riley, approximately 300 miles away. The flu didn't need a steam engine or a bustling port to travel. It needed a warm, moist lung and a crowded, stressed environment. On March 4, 1918, a company cook, Private Albert Gitchell, reported to the infirmary with a severe headache, sore throat, and a high fever. Within hours, over 100 soldiers were in the sick bay. Within a week, the number skyrocketed to over 1,100 military personnel, all manifesting the same virulent strain Miner had observed. Camp Funston was the ideal environment for the virus to mutate into a catastrophic pathogen. Density. Thousands of men, fresh from scattered American towns and farms, were packed into poorly ventilated barracks. Stress. High-intensity military training and the psychological strain of impending deployment lowered the soldiers' immune defenses. Velocity. These men were destined for Europe, the greatest human migration in history, and they would carry the infection with them on trains, transports, and trenches. The strain that left Camp Funston in March was highly infectious, but critically not yet at its most lethal. It was the first wave, a harbinger. This initial flu spread across the U.S. that spring, but it was largely seen as a bad seasonal flu and was completely overshadowed in the press by the battles in Picardy. The transatlantic ferry of death. By April 1918, American troops carrying the virus had begun landing in Brest, France. The flu moved quickly through the cramped, muddy trench systems. It spread to British, French, and German forces alike, disrupting military operations. Crucially, as the virus circulated in this densely populated, immune-compromised European cauldron, it underwent a subtle, catastrophic genetic shift. It became the second wave, the true killer. The crowded, troop-laden ships that had taken the American men to Europe now became the ultimate transmission vectors, returning the highly mutated, hyperlethal strain back to America's eastern seaboard. The virus that would kill an estimated 675,000 Americans, more U.S. soldiers than were killed in all the wars of the 20th century combined, was about to land. The veil of silence, censorship, and patriotism. The official American response to the rising death toll wasn't alarm, it was denial, dictated by the priorities of war. The Espionage and Sedition Acts. President Woodrow Wilson's administration was consumed by the necessity of national unity. Any news that might dampen morale, cause panic, or weaken the war effort was seen as a threat. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 essentially outlawed any public expression of disloyalty or criticism of the government or the war. This wartime environment created a perfect storm of government-enforced silence. Local and federal health officials were pressured to downplay the threat, labeling the disease as ordinary influenza or three-day fever. The Surgeon General, Rupert Blue, prioritized military deployment schedules over public health warnings. The press colluded. The American press, steeped in patriotic fervor, became complicit in the cover-up. Newspapers largely relegated flu reports to small, buried notices, reserving their front pages for glowing stories of Allied progress. They ran headlines like, "Flu is old-fashioned grip, no need to worry," Chicago Tribune. No cause for alarm if precautions are taken. Philadelphia Inquirer. The astonishing and tragic result was that citizens knew more about the war in Europe than the plague infecting their own streets. This complete lack of honest information meant that when the second, lethal wave struck American ports, the population was intellectually and psychologically unprepared for the scale of the disaster. The Spanish flu misnomer. The misleading name, Spanish flu, is direct from this American and Allied censorship. Spain was a neutral nation in World War I, and therefore its media was free to report on the disease's true severity. When King Alfonso XIII fell seriously ill, the Spanish press reported the story honestly and with alarm. The world's media, picking up the truthful reports, assumed the disease originated or was most severe there. The truth is, the most aggressive strains were circulating globally. But America's obsession with a morale-driven optimism filter allowed the deadly virus to sneak past its defenses, disguised as a minor inconvenience. The cost of this collective delusion would be measured in the hundreds of thousands of lives lost during the horrifying autumn of 1918. The stage was set. The virus had gestated in Kansas, traveled the Atlantic, mutated in Europe, and was now sailing back home on a massive, unsuspecting armada of returning ships, ready to exploit the gaping hole in America's national defenses, its own propaganda machine.
Chapter 2. The Two Cities, A Study in Fatal Delay. The second wave of the 1918 influenza, the infamous killer strain, arrived in the United States in late August and early September 1918. It landed in major port cities, carried by troop transports from Europe. But the virus did not behave the same everywhere. Its devastation was not merely biological, but sociological. Two cities on the eastern edge of the nation, Philadelphia and St. Louis, offer a shocking, factual comparison that serves as the moral core of the American plague story. Philadelphia, the price of patriotism. Philadelphia, then the third largest city in America and a hub for wartime shipbuilding, became the nation's epicenter of disaster. The catastrophic mistake was made not by the populace, but by its leadership, sacrificing public health on the altar of patriotism. The doomed Liberty Loan Parade. The single most consequential decision in Philadelphia's history that autumn was the insistence on holding the fourth Liberty Loan Parade on September 28, 1918. The massive patriotic demonstration was designed to raise money for the war effort. The warning ignored. The city's public health director, Dr. Wilmer Cruzen, and Navy doctors at the Philadelphia Naval Yard pleaded for the parade's cancellation. The Naval Yard was already reporting hundreds of severe flu cases, a terrifying and unmistakable signal. However, the city's political leaders, fearing a blow to morale and the failure to meet the bond quota, refused to back down. The Kaiser will read of our weakness was the prevailing attitude. The crowd gathered. An estimated 200,000 people packed the sidewalks of Broad Street, cheering and shouting. It was a perfect biological explosion, ensuring maximum droplet exchange. The catastrophe unfolded. The consequences were immediate and terrifyingly predictable. Within 72 hours of the parade, every bed in Philadelphia's 31 hospitals was full. Within a week, the city reported over 4,500 new cases. By mid-October, Philadelphia's death toll had exploded, reaching a peak of 759 deaths in a single day. The city's infrastructure collapsed entirely. Coffins ran out, forcing people to bury loved ones in blankets or sheets. Gravediggers were overwhelmed and went on strike. Bodies piled up in homes, on porches, and eventually in makeshift morgues like the city's ice rinks. The dead lay unburied for days, even weeks. Philadelphia's per capita death rate from the flu became one of the highest in the country, a direct, verifiable result of prioritizing a parade over public safety. St. Louis, the triumph of the timely shutdown. Across the continent, in the industrial heartland, St. Louis, Missouri offered a dramatic and life-saving contrast. This success story illustrates that effective leadership, grounded in scientific caution, could blunt the edge of the plague even in an era of limited medicine. A quiet, immediate response. St. Louis did not have the luxury of its own Dr. Minor, but it did have Dr. Max C. Starkloff, the city's health commissioner, an authoritative figure who took the initial distant reports of the eastern cities seriously. The critical decision. On October 7, 1918, just 2 days after the first cases were reported and 3 days before the first flu death, Dr. Starkloff issued a sweeping and immediate order. He ordered the immediate closure of schools, theaters, pool halls, public gatherings, and churches. He banned all public funerals. He made the radical decision to shut down the city's core commerce and social life before the death rate began its steep curve. A hammer-and-dance strategy. St. Louis essentially put itself into a self-imposed quarantine. This early, aggressive intervention achieved social distancing by simply not allowing large groups to form. The result, measured in lives. While the virus was just as infectious in St. Louis as in Philadelphia, Dr. Starkloff's quick action flattened the curve. The death rate was spread out over a longer period, preventing the catastrophic, simultaneous collapse of hospitals, nurses, and undertakers. St. Louis ultimately had a death rate less than half that of Philadelphia. The difference was not in geography or demographics, it was in leadership, courage, and timing. Starkloff's willingness to make unpopular decisions, he was heavily criticized by local businesses and politicians, saved thousands of St. Louis lives. The unseen heroes, Americans' nurses. As the two cities spiraled in opposite directions, the true fighting force against the plague were the nurses, overwhelmingly female volunteers and professionals, primarily from the American Red Cross. The reality was that doctors could do little more than diagnose and comfort. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics for the secondary bacterial pneumonia that killed most victims, and no effective antiviral treatments. The primary intervention was nursing care, ensuring clean bedding, providing fluids, and managing the relentless fever. A personal cost. These women worked exhausting 12-hour shifts in makeshift emergency hospitals, gymnasiums, schools, and auditoriums that often reeked of blood and carbolic acid. Their mortality rate was horrific. They died at a rate far exceeding the general population. They weren't just the unseen hand of care, they were the shock troops of the medical war, and they paid the ultimate price for the politicians' mistakes. The story of their courage, their exhaustion, and their unsung heroism is one of the most compelling and essential threads in the 1918 narrative, serving as a powerful counterpoint to the failures of the state.
Chapter 3. The Visceral Terror and the Search for a Cure. As the plague settled over America, the experience of the infected became a catalog of bizarre, rapid-fire symptoms that defied common medical knowledge. The true terror was the virus's speed and its preference for the young and the strong, a fact that drove doctors to desperation and the public to panic. The unnatural symptoms. The 1918 flu was not just a respiratory disease, it was a systemic assault. Victims often progressed from initial symptoms to death in under 48 hours. The medical records from the time paint a gruesome picture. Heliotrope cyanosis, the most distinctive and terrifying sign. Due to the rapid destruction of the lung lining and resulting internal hemorrhaging, the patient's skin, particularly around the face, fingers, and ears, would turn a peculiar, dark, purplish-blue color. This heliotrope cyanosis was the unmistakable signal that the end was near. The patient was literally suffocating in their own blood-filled lungs. Hemorrhagic manifestations. The virus didn't just affect the lungs. Many patients suffered from internal bleeding. Nurses documented cases of blood pouring from the nose, mouth, ears, and even weeping from the eyeballs. It was a disease of overwhelming viral toxicity, not just a simple pneumonia. The age paradox. The cruelest fact was the mortality curve. Typically, flu deaths follow a U-shape, hitting the very young and the very old. The 1918 flu death rate formed a stark W curve, with a massive, inexplicable spike among healthy adults aged 20 to 40. This was likely due to an overvigorous immune response or a cytokine storm, where the robust immune systems of the young tragically destroyed their own lung tissue in an attempt to fight the aggressive virus. This biological fact made the plague feel like a targeted assassination of the nation's future generation. The desperate search. Science versus folk remedies. In 1918, the medical world was largely blind. Doctors believed that influenza was caused by Pfeiffer's bacillus, a bacterium. The concept of a submicroscopic virus as the cause of human disease was only just emerging and not widely accepted. This flawed premise led to a frantic, misguided search for a bacterial vaccine or serum. The quicksilver of medicine. With no real cure, hospitals became centers of experimental, often useless treatments. The medical community was throwing everything they had at the disease, hoping something would stick. Blood transfusions. Some doctors attempted transfusions from recovered patients, hoping to transfer some protective element, eye bodies, which they couldn't see or fully understand. This was, factually, one of the few interventions that may have actually helped, though it was done haphazardly. Chemical cocktails. Patients were dosed with large amounts of aspirin, which may have unintentionally exacerbated the problem by causing hemorrhage, quinine, left over from treating malaria, and even massive doses of strychnine as a respiratory stimulant. Whiskey as an antidote. Unscrupulous proprietors and even some desperate physicians peddled whiskey and various alcohols as a cure. In some cities, wartime alcohol prohibition was temporarily suspended, not for moral reasons, but because people truly believed the alcohol was a therapeutic necessity. The flourishing of folly. Where science failed, folk remedies and outright quackery took over. The lack of reliable information, courtesy of the wartime censorship, created a vacuum filled with fear and exploitation. Onion and garlic. Some believed hanging onions or eating massive amounts of garlic would ward off the disease. Patent medicines. Companies openly advertised influenza tonics containing alcohol, narcotics, and often nothing of medical value, exploiting the public's terror. Vicks VapoRub, introduced only a few years earlier, exploded in popularity, offering psychological comfort even if its medicinal effect on the virus was non-existent. The tragic reality was that the difference between survival and death often boiled down to basic nursing care, hydration, and the simple strength of the patient's own immune system. In the face of a true viral pandemic, the technology and medical understanding of 1918 were virtually useless. The next chapter will detail how the collapse of civic order led to bizarre and drastic social measures, including the rise of the anti-mask movement and the use of the National Guard to enforce quarantines. Chapter 4. The Collapse of Order and the Mask Mandate Wars. As the death toll climbed, the federal government's policy of denial dissolved, leaving local authorities to improvise in a panic. The result was a patchwork of desperate, draconian measures that exposed deep fissures in American society, most notably in the conflict over mandatory masking. The breakdown of basic services. The plague didn't just kill people, it paralyzed the mechanisms of modern life. The essential services that hold a city together began to fail, revealing the fragility of urban society. Law and order, police forces and fire departments saw massive attrition. In some cities, as many as 30% of police officers were ill or dying. This led to a surge in looting, and the National Guard, or even local militias, were sometimes called up not to fight the enemy abroad, but to enforce quarantines and patrol empty streets. The burial crisis. The collapse of the burial system was the most horrifying public symptom of the crisis. Undertakers were overwhelmed. Many died themselves. In cities like Philadelphia, bodies lay in homes for days because no one would risk collecting them. Medical students, priests, and even convicted prisoners were pressed into service as grave diggers, often working in mass graves dug by steam shovels. The stench of decay was a palpable presence in some neighborhoods. The schoolhouse hospitals. With hospitals full, public buildings became emergency wards. Schools, churches, and even courtrooms were rapidly converted. A fact often overlooked is the improvised nature of this effort. Blankets and beds were often scarce, and oxygen was non-existent. The rise of the Anti-Mask League. In many Western American cities, particularly San Francisco, public health officials, in a desperate attempt to slow transmission, mandated the wearing of gauze masks in all public spaces. This introduced a new, surprising element of conflict: the mask wars. The enforcement. Police and civilian flu fighters were authorized to fine or even arrest people caught without a mask. Judges wore masks on the bench. Streetcar conductors refused fares from the unmasked, and people were publicly shamed. The mask became the defining symbol of the pandemic, a visible sign of compliance or defiance. The legal challenge. This mandate sparked an organized opposition. In January 1919, the Anti-Mask League of San Francisco was officially formed. Its members, mostly prominent citizens and professionals, argued that the mask was ineffective, oppressive, and an infringement on American civil liberties. They held large meetings and lobbied the city government, claiming the mandate was unscientific, un-American, and an unwarranted interference with personal freedom. The irony. The League's actions mirrored the very resistance to authority that had been suppressed by wartime laws. In a bizarre twist of fate, the fight for personal liberty was being waged by citizens demanding the freedom to ignore public health guidance during a deadly plague. The fact that this conflict over masks played out in almost identical terms over a century ago is one of the most astonishing historical parallels of the era. The invisible enemy's retreat. Just as swiftly and mysteriously as the second wave began, it began to recede in late November 1918. The disease had burned through the most susceptible populations. The signing of the armistice on November 11, 1918, ironically coincided with the worst of the death toll finally abating in many parts of the country. However, the flu was not truly gone. A third wave, less lethal but still destructive, swept through America in early 1919. It was during this third wave that the pandemic delivered its final, potentially world-altering blow to the highest levels of American government.
Chapter 5. The Plague at the Peak of Power. Wilson's Collapse. The war ended on November 11, 1918, but the flu's final, most consequential strike against America came months later, far from the battlefield, at the negotiating table of global peace. The President falls ill. President Woodrow Wilson sailed to Paris in late 1918 to lead the negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles and his cherished League of Nations. He carried with him the immense authority of the United States and a vision for a new, peaceful world order. Yet the third, lingering wave of the 1918 flu followed him. In April 1919, while intensely negotiating with French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau and British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, Wilson fell violently ill. The official explanation was a severe cold, but the symptoms documented by his physician, Dr. Cary Grayson, were classic signs of the 1918 strain. High fever, severe coughing fits, and, crucially, profound psychological and neurological distress. The fact is, Wilson's illness came at the most delicate moment of the talks. A sudden shift in stance. Before the illness, Wilson had been rigidly opposed to French and British demands for harsh reparations against Germany and territorial adjustments that contradicted his 14 points. After his recovery, his demeanor changed dramatically. He was paranoid, frequently irrational, and most tellingly, yielded to the Allied leaders' demands for concessions that fundamentally weakened the proposed League of Nations. The world remade by illness. Many historians now argue that the fever and potential neurological damage caused by the virus may have impaired Wilson's judgment, transforming him from an unwavering idealist into an incapacitated, rigid compromiser. The resulting punitive Treaty of Versailles is often cited as a contributing factor to the rise of German resentment and ultimately World War II. The unseen hand of the flu may have fundamentally altered the 20th century. Chapter 6: The Demographic Scars and the Silence. As the virus receded in the spring of 1919, its demographic and social impact on the United States became terrifyingly clear. The forgotten dead. The final death toll in the U.S. was approximately 675,000 people. This number is shocking not just for its magnitude, but for its distribution. The plague specifically targeted those aged 20 to 40, America's most economically productive and reproductive generation. The economic shock. The sudden, widespread loss of young workers delivered a severe, though temporary shock to the U.S. economy. The flu accelerated the mechanization of many industries as businesses, unable to rely on human labor, sought machines to fill the gaps. The pandemic exacerbated labor shortages, contributing to a post-war climate of strikes and social unrest, including the Red Summer of 1919, where economic anxieties and racial tensions boiled over. A generation of orphans. The death of so many parents created a massive number of orphans and fractured countless families. This cohort of children, raised in poverty or by extended family, carried the emotional scar of the plague, a fact largely erased from official histories. The willful amnesia. Perhaps the most astonishing and lasting effect of the 1918 flu was the national amnesia that followed. Despite killing 10 times more Americans than the Great War, the Spanish flu was not commemorated with monuments, holidays, or even prominent chapters in history books. The need for optimism. Americans, wearied from 4 years of war and the subsequent societal trauma of the plague, collectively chose to forget. The prevailing national mood was a desperate craving for a return to normalcy, a term popularized by presidential candidate Warren Harding. The nation did not want to dwell on a disaster that highlighted governmental incompetence, medical ignorance, and the fragility of life. Furthermore, the victory in the Great War provided a grand, heroic narrative to embrace, complete with parades and triumphant headlines. The flu offered only a story of senseless, messy death and fear. The psychological choice was easy. Celebrate the soldier, forget the victim. This collective silence meant that when the next major pandemic threat arrived a century later, the vast, detailed lessons learned by Dr. Starkloth in St. Louis and the bitter failures of Dr. Treason in Philadelphia were largely unstudied, unlearned, and relegated to dusty medical journals. Epilogue: The Lesson of the Unseen Hand. The story of the 1918 plague is the story of the limits of power and the power of biology. It exposed the danger of censorship overriding scientific truth and confirmed the eternal conflict between civic duty and individual liberty. It was a disaster that reshaped American policy, influenced a world war's peace treaty, and then was deliberately pushed into the shadows. The forgotten plague of 1918 remains a cautionary tale, a 20th century warning that lay dormant for a century, waiting for the day the unseen hand would rise again.